This is Peter Helland on Citizens for Community Media, and I call the show Back to the Fundamentals. I was in Chicago yesterday. My job, I deliver vehicles up all over the country. I had to take one to a suburb in Chicago, so I'm making my way back. I'm on the Metro train that goes from Joliet to Chicago, back and forth. And I'm talking to a lady a few years younger than me because the train was late. And we get talking about how bad it is in Chicago. And I said, well, you got a strange mayor. She goes, well, we thought she would be the right one, because she gave her explanation. Well, it didn't work, and the crime is still the sore spot. And more and more with the internet, people are more aware that there's these glaring statistics, and we don't know what to do with them exactly. The statistic that 3% of the black males are committing over 50% of the crime. We don't know, how true are those, but we do know, black or white, the family structure is breaking down. And people in Chicago are, they're leaving. It's getting chaotic. People are just shooting. They just had that 26-year-old policewoman shot. She was just handling a normal call, and they just started, just mowed her down. They didn't used to do that. Well, there's a connection between the breakdown of the family and these things happening. And she asked me where I'm from. I said, well, I live in South Bend, but I'm from Wisconsin. And Illinois people, when they think of Wisconsin, they think of, in the past, vacationing, and I'm from the Dells. So most of the people were from Chicago. Both my grandparents on both sides originated from Chicago. So Chicago is our mother's language. But at the same time, we hate Chicago. South Bend's called Little Chicago. Well, there's this love-hate because you got Chicago-type problems. Chicago is notorious for being maybe the most corrupt city in the country. And South Bend, St. Joe County, they have a reputation that's a little bit behind that. So what do people like about Wisconsin? Well, they like, it's God's country, the beauty, it's catered for tourists, and you go up there and you get away from Chicago. But it's also noted for the Green Bay Packers, who were put on the map by Vince Lombardi. And Lombardi's noted for teaching back to the fundamentals. Football is blocking and tackling. And I was raised up under that. And for some reason, I was made for football. So when I was little, if somebody come to the door, the first thing I wanted to do was tackle them. It didn't really matter who it was. I was probably 2 or 3. That's what I felt like doing. Get my arms around their legs and see if I could take them down. And then I continued to love that, and we got into football, and that's what I love to do. And our high school team, we were last place my junior year, and our senior year we were first place. And we knocked out a team that nobody thought we could beat. They had a couple guys that went to the pros. And the Packers back then would come to your house. I remember my dad waking me up one time and said, hey, Ray Nitschke wants to meet with you. So those kind of things would happen. But Lombardi had a secret. And the secret was he could create an intensity because he boiled that game down to the basics. And because that because he created an intensity on the basics, the Packers, even though they weren't, Bart Starr was a 16th round draft choice. The Packers weren't necessarily that great. My team, my junior year, we were last place. But my senior year, these were the people I grew up with, kindergarten all the way up. So we had an intensity just because of growing up, and we had an intensity on that game, and we ended up in first place, co-champ. First place with somebody else. But when you can boil things down to the basics, then you have a much better chance for success. So how do you look at the American experiment? How do you function in this country? How do you isolate where the real issues are? And that's what we're going to try to do a little bit. And to start, you got to get the background to where Christianity is coming in trouble in this American experiment, as I call it. In 1776, they had a great pamphlet war, great debate. And the ones that led the debate against the American experiment were the Methodists, John Wesley and John Fletcher. And Fletcher was the guy who wrote the most about it. He was Wesley's replacement, is the one he was mentoring to take his place. Fletcher said, if the Americans are going to operate on the principles they're operating on, they're going to have to throw the scriptures away, because these principles are opposite to the scriptures. The scriptures are emphatic that the husband's authority in the home comes from God. The king's authority comes from God. If you disobey your husband, you're disobeying God. Obey your husband as unto Christ. If you disobey the king, you're disobeying God. Now, that of course means if the king is telling you to do something sinful, it switches. Then you have a duty to disobey him. If your husband is telling you to do something sinful, now you have a duty to disobey him. But when he's commanding you to do something that's not sinful or radically unreasonable, however you want to say it, you have a duty to obey, because God commands you to obey. America got rid of that. We said, no, the government's authority comes from the consent of the governed. And Fletcher argued that will destroy marriage, because now the husband his authority comes obviously from the consent of his wife. That's insane. Well, this came to a head in the Civil War, because the South saw this was the problem. And the South tried to get out, and they realized the problem over the issue of slavery. But the principle wasn't from slavery. The principle came from Scripture, that authority is created by God. Now, whether it's the authority of the slave master or the authority of the king, the authority of the parents or the authority of the father, the principle is God created authority. And he initiated it through Adam. Adam was given the authority initially. So ultimately, basically, all authority comes through Adam. Of course, we live in a culture where Adam is not relevant, Adam is not known, Adam is not a factor on the table, especially at universities. And even some seminaries don't believe that Adam and Eve are historically what the scriptures say they are. So in the Civil War, it really came to a head, and the North won that war. And the South had the best theologians, by far. And one of them was Robert Lewis Dabney, and he was so good of a theologian that Stonewall Jackson requested that Dabney would be his chief of staff. It was quite controversial, and Dabney agreed to be his chief of staff. But the reason Jackson wanted him, he knew he was the best theologian in the South. That's who he wanted at his side, somebody guiding him precisely. He wanted to make sure he was in God's will. Now, that was a little bit different than General Hooker, who Hooker and Jackson battled at Chancellorsville. Hooker wanted prostitutes or hookers at his side. Maybe I'm a little harsh, but it's pretty atrocious, really. So Dabney then writes up till 1896 or so, and when he died, but he wrote extensively about the consequences of the South losing that war. And he boiled things down. That's what he was good at. He was good at boiling things down. And so with the North winning immediately, then the blacks were given the right to vote. And Dabney said, well, obviously the women are going to be given a right to vote because the women are going to argue, well, we're smarter than the blacks. Look at how stupid they are. Why would they be given the right to vote and not us? And they almost achieved the right to the vote right after the Civil War, but they didn't. It took about 60 years before they finally got it. But Dabney saw that it was coming. So he writes, this is about 1873, Women's Rights, Women. He says, what then in the next place will be the effect of this fundamental change when it shall be established? The obvious answer is that it will destroy Christianity and civilization in America. It's a no-brainer. Now, it may take a little while. The women didn't get the right to vote like they wanted right after the war. It took 60 years, but eventually it was going to happen. He says that this is inevitable, that it will happen, and he gives all the scriptures that the women, where the women are to be. He quotes the scriptures, and he says how utterly opposed is all these scriptures, to the leveling doctrine of your radical. Women are here consigned to a social subordination and expressly excluded from ruling offices on grounds of their sex, and a divine ordination based by God upon a transaction which happened nearly 6,000 years ago. You got to remember, in the South, anybody that taught anywhere in the South, basically, that Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible, or they brought in any notion that evolution had any validity, you pretty much had to leave the South because you weren't going to get a job anywhere, because they had that down. And Dabney was the leader of opposing that. And Princeton was the main seminary. And I've said this many times, but the president of Princeton, Archibald Alexander, I think it was, said that Dabney was the best theologian in the South, if not the world. So he writes, the women's sphere is expressly assigned her within her home, and she is taught that the assumption of publicity is an outrage against that nature with which she is endowed. Now, that was a common belief for all Christianity. Richard Weaver, who's famous, the University of Chicago, which is super liberal, but Weaver was still there. And Weaver said, he came up with ideas have consequences, but he said the South was the last Christian nation. That's what he said. Now, you could, however you want to argue it. And Dabney writes, because Christianity said women are not to be in public. It's like what he says here. We don't even understand this today. The woman's sphere is expressly assigned her within her home, after he gave all the scriptures. That I don't want to go through all those scriptures, but basically, wives are to obey their husbands as unto Christ. The man is not for the woman, but the woman for the man. Let the woman learn and sign. All those scriptures that we should know. The woman's sphere is expressly assigned her within her home, and she is taught that the assumption of publicity is an outrage against that nature with which she is endowed. Now, the politics which denounce all this as a natural injustice and self-evident folly cannot be expected to reverence these scriptures. They must and will flout their whole authority. We must then make up our minds in accepting women's rights to surrender our Bibles and have an atheistic government. But of course, don't forget, Fletcher said the same thing, 1776. And the South Air, of course, they held on to the principles of the American Revolution, which could be read both ways. And the South was thinking, well, I think we can read them this way, but I think that's where the South really got in trouble. Dabney writes, and especially must we expect to have, presiding over every home and rearing every group of future citizens, that most abhorrent of all phenomena, an infidel woman running the home. For of course that sex, having received the precious boon of their enfranchisement only by means of the overthrow of the Bible, must be foremost in trampling upon this their old oppressor and enemy. So he's saying, who's going to be the greatest enemy of trying to get the Bible back? The women. The women. Its restoration to authority is necessarily their re-enslavement, to speak the language of their party. I mean, do you know what the Bible says about what women's place? They are to be keepers at home. They are not to speak in church. They are to obey their husbands as unto Christ with a godly fear. Must have the covering on the head when they go to church. You think they're gonna submit to that? Well, every man knows they're not, and they know that its restoration to the Bible's restoration to authority is necessarily their re-enslavement, to speak the language of their party. Then he says, second, these new excitements and temptations will utterly corrupt the character and delicacy of American women. It is indignantly asked, why should politics corrupt the morals of women more than of the lords of creation? Suppose now we reply, Dabney says, American politics have corrupted the morals of men. Suppose we argue that the retort is so true and just, and the result has actually gone to so deplorable an extent that were the female side of our social organization as corrupt as the male side has already become, American society would crumble into ruin by its own petrutions. Putrefying. Dabney writes, it is better to save half the fabric than to lose all. And especially is it better to save the purity of the mothers who are under God to form the characters of our future citizens, and of the wives who are to restrain and elevate them, whatever else we endanger. Is it argued that since women are now confessedly purer than men, their entrance into politics must tend to purify politics? We reply again that the women of the present are reared and attained this comparative purity under the Bible system. And of course, he's talking, Southern women were pretty pure. And a lot of the women were pure back then. Adopt the infidel plan, and we shall corrupt our women without purifying our politics. What shall save us then? Look at the politics now. They had the lowest rating of anybody, maybe worse than car salesmen, maybe worse than lawyers, people in politics. Look at Mario Cuomo. His children, Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York for another 14 days, Chris Cuomo, CNN, Mario, corrupt. Mario came to Notre Dame, the governor came to Notre Dame in 1984, I heard him speak, and he was so immoral, it wasn't funny. It had people thinking. Because he says, well, I'm against abortion privately, but as governor, I'm for it. Well, that's a lawyer. Because he serves two sets of laws. Our legal system is contrary to God's legal system. There's God's law, and then the lawyers uphold laws passed by the rich people, I guess, that totally contradict Christianity. Well, which one are you, Mario? Well, look at your children. Look at how corrupt they are. Well, of course. They don't know what's right and wrong. Which system are you serving? The legal system, which says sodomy's fine? Or are you going to say you're a Catholic and say it's wrong? Dabney writes, but there is another reply to this report. Political excitement will corrupt women tenfold more than men. And this, not because women are naturally inferior to men, but because they are naturally adapted to a wholly different sphere. when we point to the fact that they are naturally more emotional and less calculating, more impulsive and less self-contained, that they have a quicker tact but less logic, that their social nature makes them more liable to the contagion of epidemic passions, and that the duties of their sex make it physically impossible for them to acquire the knowledge of a foreign sphere necessary for political duties. We do not depreciate women. We only say that nature has adapted her to one thing and disqualified her for the other. The violet would wither in that full glare of midsummer in which the sunflower thrives. This does not argue that the violet is the meaner flower. The vine, left to stand alone, would be hurried prone in the mire by the first blast of that history. It goes on. So it will be found, and it is no disparagement to women to say it, that the very traits which fit her to be the angel of a virtuous home unfit her to meet the agitations of political life, even as safely as does the more rugged man. The hot glare of publicity and passion will speedily deflower her delicacy and sweetness. Those temptations which her Maker did not form her to bear will debauch her heart, developing a character as much more repulsive than that of the debauched man as the fall has been greater. The politicating woman, unsexed and denaturalized, shorn of the true glory of her femininity, will appear to men as a feeble hybrid mannequin, with all the defects and none of the strength of the male. Instead of being the dear object of his chivalrous affection, she becomes his importunate rival, despised without being feared. And then he says there's a third consequence. And the third consequence, he quotes Miss Katie Stanton, who happened to be the niece of Garrett Smith, who happened to be the one of the Secret Six that funded John Brown. And, you know, how revolutionary were the Northerners? They were, you know, right now we're in this movement. People are scared to death almost that we're having a communist takeover, that the military's basically gone communist, that this country's in for such a radical reset. We're just going to go full-blown communism. People are scared. Well, what do you think the South felt? Who do you think they were fighting against? They have the story. Robert E. Lee had already surrendered at Appomattox, but there was still some fighting. And so the last people that surrendered, I think it was Tyler, and Tyler was the son of one of the presidents. I think it was Tyler. And, you know, the South had, their heritage went back to the founding, you know, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. I mean, they were so connected to the early founders. And so they finally had to surrender some of the, you know, the last battle, and they were up against total divisions that only spoke German. And the Germans, when they finally had to surrender, and the Germans are lecturing them, you know, about what America's supposed to be, you know, what's right and wrong. And these guys are like, hold it here. We're the children, we're the grandsons, a lot of us, of the ones that founded it. Well, that's what happens. You know, America is constantly being redone. So the Civil War, you had these Republican Party, their base was foyer rights, they were communists. The Southerners had them down. They called them red Republicans, atheists, communists, black Republicans. Well, yeah, that's who they were. They were not Christians. They had radical notions that went to destroy Christianity. And of course, Thomas Paine cloaked his book Common Sense. He would use all kinds of scripture. But John Wesley and Fletcher saw right through it. But the Americans didn't. The next books that Thomas Paine wrote were directly aimed to destroy Christianity, to disprove it. And that was Lincoln's favorite author, Thomas Paine, along with Theodore Parker. And Theodore Parker was hooked up with Gerrit Smith, the uncle to Katie Stanton. Theodore Parker was one of the biggest preachers in Boston. He denied all the miracles. He was a radical Unitarian. And he hooked up with Gerrit Smith and 4 of the others. The purpose was to fund John Brown and help him get the weapons at the federal depot in Harper's Ferry, get those guns to arm the blacks so the blacks could kill their slave master. Theodore Parker argued the blacks had a duty to kill their slave master because that's how valuable freedom is. If somebody's keeping you from being free, you have a duty to kill them to get your freedom. Some people thought that was radical. And the Republicans were all for this. This is the Republican Party. They were for this. They supported a book by Hinton Rowan Helper, The Impending Crisis. This is what he promoted. Republicans passed this book out to everybody in the Congress who would take it. So it was radical. So Dabney knew how radical they were trying, what kind of agenda they were trying to impose. And he said it went right to the family. It went right to the husband and wife relationship. That's where they were aiming. And so he says, a third consequence of the advocates, which some of the advocates of the movement even already are bold enough to foreshadow. Women's rights means the abolition of all permanent marriage ties, which is where we're at now. We are told that Mrs. Katie Stanton avowed this result, proclaiming it at the invitation of the Young Men's Christian Association of New York. Yeah, New York, that's the kind of Christianity they had. She holds that women's bondage is not truly dissolved until the marriage bond is annulled. She is thoroughly consistent. Some hoodwinked advocates of her revolution may be blind to the sequence, but it is inevitable. It must follow by this cause, if for no other, that the unsexed, politicating woman can never inspire in man that true affection on which marriage should be founded. Men will doubtless be still sensual, but it is simply impossible that they can desire them for the pure and sacred sphere of the wife. Let every woman ask herself, will she choose for the lord of her affections an unsexed, effeminate man? No more can man be drawn to the masculine woman. The mutual attractions of the two complementary halves is gone forever. The abolition of marriage would follow again by another cause. This is where we're at. This is what Dabney wrote in 1873. He saw it coming. It just took a little while. But he did write right after the war. He said, in Defense of Virginia, his book, 1866, he said it'll be about 200 years before they would listen to what he was saying. He's pretty close. Another reason why this thing is going to fall apart. The divergent interest and the rival independence of the two equal wills would be irreconcilable with domestic government or union or peace. Shall the children of this monstrous no union be held responsible to two variant, coordinate, and supreme wills at once? Heaven pity the children. Shall the two parties to this perpetual co-partnership have neither the power to secure the performance of the mutual duties nor to dissolve it? It is a self-contradiction and impossible absurdity. Such a co-partnership of equals with independent interests must be inseparable at will, as all other such co-partnerships are. The only relation between the sexes which will remain will be a cohabitation continuing so long as the convenience or caprice of both parties may suggest, and this with most will amount to a vagrant concubinage. Okay, I'm saying that to lead up to a fundamental that is so essential that if you lose this fundamental, you're not going to be able to function. Society will just disintegrate. This is what the next paragraph is going to hone in on that. Now, 20 years ago, I used to read this all the time on the public access here for those who are going to see this on YouTube. And in fact, over and over again, I had this paragraph memorized. I just kept saying, I just love this paragraph. I kept just saying it memorized all the time. And because in here contains the fundamental that the Yankees, the Northerners, the people in Chicago totally lost. I don't know if they ever had it. And because they lost this fundamental, you got anarchy and barbarism coming out of Chicago. That lady I was talking to at the train, she was going, I don't know, I wonder how it got this way. I can't figure it out. Yeah, you can. You just don't want to. And you don't want to be honest. So, here's the paragraph. And here it contains the fundamental. Dabney writes, but now, what will be the character of the children reared under such a domestic organization as this? Okay, so the American Civil War, the fanatics, the communists out of the 1848 revolution, Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto, 1848. Millions came over. They all basically fought for the North. They couldn't pull off the revolution in Europe. Now they're going to pull it off here. The Civil War is what they used to get their communist revolution going. The Republican Party were fundamentally Marxist and communist. People hate to know that. Tommy Thompson was governor in Wisconsin for 4 terms, and I remember once the Capital Times wrote an editorial reminding Tommy, because they were against Tommy Thompson, reminding Tommy Thompson that the Republican Party, their origin was communist. You could probably find that on the internet. Yeah, because that was Horace Greeley, and they were connected to the Fourierites. It was French communism, but it was the same idea. It was the destruction of a Christian home. Okay, so what will be the character of the children that are now going to be reared under this revolutionized home structure, revolutionizing the husband-wife relationship? Dabney writes, if human experience has established anything at all, it is the truth of that principle announced by the Hebrew prophet when he declared that the great aim of God in ordaining a permanent marriage tie between one man and one woman was, quote, Book of Malachi, chapter 2, verse 15, was, quote, that he might seek a godly seed. Okay, now there you have a fundamental that's so fundamental. If you don't know this, I don't even know how you're functioning. You're gone. If you don't know this and you don't know it well, what's the purpose of marriage? The Catholics emphasize this more than the Protestants. The purpose of sex is procreation. The Protestants say, well, the purpose of sex is pleasure and procreation. The Catholics were, procreation. Well, here it's saying, Dabney is affirming what was always known, that the purpose of marriage is that God is seeking a godly seed. So when two people come together, what's God bringing them together for? God is seeking a godly seed, godly children. That's the purpose of your marriage. What are you getting married for? Save money. It's easier. Two living together, you can save money. Okay. So the great aim of God in ordaining a permanent marriage tie between one man and one woman was that he might seek a godly seed. Okay, so all your energies, when you get married, everything has to be zeroed in. When Lombardi started his season at the Packers, I remember listening to the Packers before Lombardi came in. And I knew the names. I knew Hugh McElhenney. That was the name I loved. My mom was into the Braves, Milwaukee Braves. She's from Milwaukee. And the Packers. The Braves they were much bigger than the Packers. But then they had the game of 1958, the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants. And I happened to see that game. age 6. Glued in on that. They called it the greatest game ever played. The intensity was unbelievable, and that caused football to then become more popular than baseball. Packers were like last place. Lombardi takes over, and kaboom, right away, they're competing with the Eagles. Van Brocklin. But Lombardi had the ability to locate what's the essence, and that's what he focused on. And because he focused on the essence of the game and kept the focus there, they won, they won, they won. So what's the essence? What are you getting married for? What's the purpose? The purpose is everything is to go to raise godly offspring. Why? That's what God's looking for. That's how you're going to please God. Everything you do better be godly, aiming at godliness. You better know what it is. What is godliness? Well, it's basically obedience, fearing God. How are you going to raise godly offspring? Well, Dabney goes into it. He writes, God's ordinance, the only effective human ordinance for checking and curbing the first tendencies to evil, is domestic parental government. And before I forget, I might add, a lot of people are thinking of homeschooling, way late. They should have been homeschooling. There shouldn't be any public schools, okay? Those are just orphanages. Government school is an orphan. It's for orphans, okay? Because a real parent wouldn't send their kids there. The South had no public schools. Dabney was against Christian schools. So when the South lost and the government, first thing they wanted to do was jam government schools down the South, Dabney wrote one essay after another, arguing. Of course, he knew it was futile. They were going to jam it down by a barrel of a gun. But he said there's nothing worse than government schools. There's nothing worse than public schools. Point by point. Nobody has ever come up with an argument for homeschooling yet, to this day, better than Dabney. Because he knew what the family was about. He says, when the family shall no longer have a head, and the great foundation for the subordination of children in the mother's example is gone. Okay, now we're looking at a fundamental here, and it's going to go right by you. People in the North actually, even like 25 years ago, the people in the North were completely oblivious to this. The South still had it. And what are they oblivious to? That the primary way that you're going to raise godly children is the mother's example. That's how you're going to raise godly children. That's why in the Old Testament, the biggest sin, where the prophets would pull their hair out. They would grab somebody and pull his hair out, pull the beard out. What caused them to do that? It's the only thing you see, something that they did caused the prophets to pull beards out, pull hair out. They didn't normally do that. Why? When you married the wrong woman. That was the end of everything, because the kids imprint on their mama. Whatever their mom does, they do. Whatever she says, whatever's in her spirit comes out, that's what they're going to copy. So if the goal is godly children, and then you marry a woman that you haven't certified and vetted and guaranteed what comes out of her mouth is going to be godly, everything she does is going to be godly, you haven't guaranteed that, then you're a fool. Now, we know no one's perfect, but if you haven't made it your best effort to marry a woman who is truly godly, that will fear you as unto Christ, obey you as unto Christ. If you haven't certified that, then the purpose of marriage is defeated, because you're not going to raise godly offspring. They're going to be what their mom is. And if she has a bad attitude, if she is not completely a believer in the teachings of Christ and fears God enough that she obeys those teachings, then your children are going to turn out like their mom. The South knew that. The North The North didn't even see it, really. Still don't see it. And the South has been, it's not what it was. But he says, when the family shall no longer have a head, and the great foundation for the subordination of children in the mother's example is gone. Okay? Subordination of children. Children, St. Paul said a child is the same as a slave. Oh, but slavery's wrong. Well, then childhood's wrong. Because why is a child same as a slave? Because a slave must obey its master, and the children must obey their parents. That's why. This is so serious. Jesus said if children speak evil of their parents, curse their parents, Jesus said it twice, they are to be put to death. Now, what do we do with that? Well, he said it. That's for us to wrestle with. But that's why it's so important that if you actually meditate on the words of Christ, St. Paul said, let the words of Christ richly dwell within you. Well, he said whoever curses his parents is to be put to death. Well, let's meditate on it. What's going to cause a child to speak evil of their parents? Well, if the mother does it, guaranteed they're going to. The Hebrew word is make light. So if you have a mom that makes light of her husband, then the children are going to make light of the husband, and they're to be put to death for that. Now, it doesn't say that the woman is to be put to death if she makes light and speaks evil of her husband, but the children are to be put to death. Her beloved children. Because these mothers, they love their children. Don't touch my darlings. So how has it gotten this way? Because there's enemies of the church out there, and we have a legal system. This is what they're teaching. They're teaching at the universities. It says they teach things which they ought not to for filthy lucre's sake. Subverting whole households. They're subverting the household. They're subverting the notion that the man is God's authority in that home, and that the woman must obey her husband as unto Christ. Our legal system subverts that. That's what it says in Titus. It says, for there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, the Jewish, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not for filthy lucre's sake. It says, then Paul says, he commands them, do not give heed to Jewish fables. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny him. Well, we know God's already told us how the home has to be run. You say you believe in God, and you're not running your home the way God says, you deny God. You're denying him. You're an atheist. Your actions show that you're an atheist. You're denying him by your actions. So if you're the husband and you're not ruling that home like God says you're to rule that home, you're denying God. And you're the wife, and you say you're a Christian, you know God, and you're not fearing your husband like you're commanded to. Ephesians 5, wives are to phobia their husbands. And you're not obeying him as unto Christ. You profess to know God, but in works they deny him. Why are you denying Christ? When you don't fear and obey your husband as unto Christ, why are you denying Christ? Well, I don't see it that way. Well, that's how God sees it. And on Judgment Day, you'll find out that that's how he sees it. And you ought to get the fear of God in you. And the preachers ought to instruct you on that. But they don't want to tell you that because that'll make you uncomfortable. That'll make you uncomfortable. And we don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. So Dabney says, the great foundation for the subordination of children is in the mother's example. The man is to rule his home and rule it well, having his children in subjection with all gravity. The man must, he is commanded to have his children in subjection with all gravity. Which means, how can you allow your children to watch a sitcom on TV, which is to produce laughing and foolishness. What's it mean to have your children, you're commanded, you must rule your home well, and you must have your children in subjection with all gravity. You're going to basically do that by marrying the right woman who will model that in front of the children, and the children will copy her. People are generally copycats. That's why when we grew up, we always, you're a copycat. You know, the worst thing you could be called, almost, the worst thing was to be called a copycat. Because that's what we are by nature. And children, God set it up that way. Train up a child in the way he ought to go, and when he gets old, he will not depart of it. How do you train up a child in the way he ought to go? They copy their mom. They see their mother fearing their father with that godly fear and obeying their father as unto Christ. How far does that take those children on the path of godliness and making those children a godly seed, godly offspring, which is the purpose of marriage? So the very purpose of marriage is defeated right from the gate when you marry the wrong woman, because the children will become what their mom is. And if she is not a godly woman, and if she doesn't understand and she's not practiced in godliness, which is fundamentally fearing the husband as unto Christ and obeying him as unto Christ. If she doesn't know how to do that, if she is not doing that, then the mission of marriage is defeated. The Southerners knew that. Our culture does not know it. So when the great foundation for the subordination of children in the mother's example is gone, when the mother shall have found another sphere than her home for her energies, when the mother shall have found another sphere than her home for her energies, when she shall have exchanged the sweet charities of domestic love and sympathy for the fierce passions of the hustings, marketplace. As soon as you send your child to public school, the purpose is to get the women to have a career. That's the purpose. Get them on a career track. That public school is not set up to urge them to be a keeper at home, which they kind of were back up till World War II. Even the public schools were urging the women to be into homemaking and to be keepers at home. It changed after World War II. When she shall exchange the sweet charities of domestic love and sympathy for the fierce passions of the hustings, when families shall be disrupted at the caprice of either party, and the children scattered as foundlings from their hearthstone, it requires no wisdom to see that a race of sons will be reared nearer akin to devils than to men. In the hands of such a bastard progeny, without discipline, without homes, without a God, the last remains of social order will speedily perish, and society will be overwhelmed in savage anarchy. So that lady is going, I don't know what's happening. You know, they just shot that woman in Cobb. It's just getting, I thought the mayor, we thought she was the answer. They thought she was the answer? She made it a lot worse. Are these people even thinking in Chicago? No, they do not want to know, because the Civil War, this is the land of Lincoln. Look at those license plates. They got Lincoln's photo in the back. Lincoln brought in seances in the White House. His wife was practicing continual seances in the White House, which is a medium. The Bible is so clear. You're to be put to death for that. Everybody in the South knew, hold it here. You're supposed to be mediums are supposed to be put to death. If you're practicing seance, you're supposed to be put to death. Well, children that curse their parents are supposed to be put to death too, so it's all chaos. Makes no sense to people. Because once you refuse to obey Christ, at one point, the thing's going to unravel. And we started in 1776. We had no right to disobey the king and to claim, authority comes from the consent of the people. Fletcher and Wesley said that was satanic. Of course it was satanic. It was Masonic. And the South tried to get out. They couldn't, because they had one foot in one camp They believed in 1776, and they saw how crazy the communists were in the North. And they got out too late. So he closes, and he says, instead of being what the Bible makes her, the wife, one with her husband, queen of his home, reigning with the gentle scepter of love over her modest, secluded domain, and in its pure and sacred retirement, performing the noblest work done on this earth, that of molding infant minds to honor and piety. She will reappear from this ill-starred competition, because she's now competing with men. She will reappear from this ill-starred competition, defeated and despised, tolerated only to satiate the passion, to amuse the idleness, to do the drudgery, and to receive the curses and blows of her barbarized masters. That's what the women are going to be facing, because there will be a reaction. Dabney's predicting this way back then, and people are seeing it coming. A man is 4 times stronger than a woman. I'm just guessing. A normal soldier could take on 4 women back in normal World War II. So, how are the women ruling the homes today? They are ruling the homes. Most men are henpecked by old-time standards. But eventually the men are going to rise up. So he says, thus will be consummated that destiny to which so many gloomy prognostics point as the allotment of the North American continent, to be the accursed field for the final illustration of the harvest of perdition grown from the seeding of the dragon's teeth of infidel radicalism. And Dabney just says this is above all, they have insulted him. They have insulted God by flaunting in his face an impudent, atheistic, God-defying theory of pretended human rights and human perfectibility, which attempts to deny man's subordination, his dependence, his fall, and his native depravity, his need of divine grace. Well, that's what we see now. That's what the communist movement here in the United States is going on. But the communist movement, Dabney's saying, this is where it came from. It's always been there. This country's always been full of communist thoughts. It's just a matter of just pushing it over the edge. And that's what's happening. They're just, what do you think is being taught at the universities? Who is the most despised man of the 20th century? I would say in this country, at the university and education. Probably Joe McCarthy. And you could argue, well, who's the greatest guy of the 20th century? Maybe Joe McCarthy. Oh, which one is it? He's the most evil? Most despised because he's the most evil, or he's the greatest? Well, which one is it? 100 million people were killed by communism, and what was Joe McCarthy's mission? To identify with the people being murdered by communism and to try to rescue them. That was his mission. And that's why he's considered evil. Yeah, by the communists. But by the people that don't like dying from communism, which was 100 million. I mean, you had China and Russia just together. How many is it? 100 million, 150 million? And this evil guy, Joe McCarthy, goes, I don't think that's right. Well, the communists hate him for speaking out on that. That's who Dabney, that's who he said he was up against in the North, people like that. And he said, and thus women's rights will assist America, quote, to fulfill her great mission, that of being the scarecrow of the nations. See, the world's going to be looking, what's happening to America? I can't believe it. What's happening? I thought they believed in First Amendment rights and elections, and the election integrity. They don't even want an audit. Hold it here. You're supposed to keep all the records for 2 years after an election. Why? Just in case maybe there's 1 or 2 votes that were cheated on. Well, how about if half the votes were cheated on? The world is going, what is happening to America? Dabney would say the ideas of revolution, the radical communist ideas are now coming to play. And especially are they coming to play in the home. Because once you say the husband and wife are equal, there is no head, like Abraham. There is no man functioning in Abraham's role. And there is no wife functioning in Sarah's role. And a woman's supposed to be a daughter of Sarah. You can't be a Christian wife and not be a daughter of Sarah. If you're not a daughter of Sarah, you're not a Christian. And the daughter of Sarah was what? you had to be like Sarah. She obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and she fought off fear. That's not what's happening. You don't have these women obeying their husbands, and you don't have them calling them Lord like they did up to the Civil War. For about 1850 years of Christianity, women called their husbands Lord or Master, and they obeyed them as unto Christ, and they fought off fear. These women are giving into fear all across the board, but they're commanded, you fight off fear. Don't give in to fear, because that's what women do. They get fearful. But they're commanded not to give in to fear, and they're commanded obey their husband as unto Christ, like Sarah did Abraham. The American Civil War demolished that. Demolished it. That's what Dabney was saying. And what we can expect is that we will be overwhelmed in savage anarchy. And what's going to save the day? The only thing that could possibly save it would be the Christians creating strong churches and creating women that are our daughters of Sarah, creating wives that will give the example of godliness to their children so that they will raise a godly seed. What is God seeking? A godly seed. These are fundamentals. That marriage is about, God wants marriage to come to, a husband and wife to come together because He is seeking a godly seed. And the key to it is the children imitate their mom. And when they see her obeying their dad as unto Christ, when they see her maintaining a godly reverence and fear toward their dad, they will do likewise, most likely. And you don't have that, your culture will collapse. And what do we see happening in Chicago? In these cities, the collapse. They're fleeing Chicago. So you can't think on this too much, because if you're going to get married or you're in a marriage, and if you don't do it right, you're going to be responsible for how those children turn out. And my people perish for lack of knowledge. So hopefully this is helpful. Peter Helland on Citizens for Community Media.